I want to start with something that you said at the end, which was about how really the impetus and the reason you keep doing this is not so much about the sound and health aha moment, which I think if people, even including me, hear your story externally, tend to think that is like the catalyzing moment. But it's really this promise that you made to yourself in a very personal way. So I guess how has your relationship to that narrative evolved over time? Is this something that you always felt? Is this something that now you're realizing in retrospect? Because
Yeah.
in my life, I guess the reason I asked this question is with ASAP, I had a story that I said externally, which was around this catalyzing incident, around a suicide in my family. That was part of my story, kind of in the way that you said it, but not my whole story. And I realized the reason I continued to stay with ASAP, the reason I was so energized by the work, was by the individual relationships I formed within the community. And
Right.
so it resonates with me, particularly you sharing that latter point, because I actually would not have guessed that about you. And so I'm just interested in your reflection on that, and how you've experienced that over time.
Yeah. There is an element that I wouldn't call my external narrative fiction in any way, because there is it is a element of a truth. It's just I don't going back to the experience of a halcyon incubator, and part of that is to be able to do this pitch to a group of judgmental people who are waiting to jump on you. And part of that is, there is a implicit and explicit pressure for each fellow to, I'm not saying this, entirely negative way, but package the story in ways that could be catchy.
Mhm.
Like in 10 minutes, I can't get into my personal story that much, but just enough for that to be a story. And in the process, certain part of the story gets emphasized more than the other, and the story itself starts to gain a life of its own, and you kind of start to tell yourself that was a story. So somehow that story starts to define your life in some way. I think there was an element of that. In my case, I had this awareness, the issue of a hospital noise needed like a character or a spokesperson that people can relate to somehow. And it wasn't really
Mm.
about me, it was more like me as a backstage playing the role of Yoko Sen, the founder of Sen Sound,
Mhm.
playing the character. Once again, it's not a fiction, it's not a fake, but so that the issue can get the spotlight and support that it needs, that it
Mhm.
had been ignored for many years. So there was an element of a sense of a service. In my life as a musician, that wasn't the case. There was a little bit of a more of a unhealthy morphing between, like, my music is me kind of a thing. But with Sense Sound, I think I'm constantly in this mindset that this is not about me, this is never about me. So I play
Mm.
this character that would help people to relate to the issue. But I do certainly relate to your point. I don't know if it's appropriate to bring this in this podcast, but after our last conversation, I felt guilty a little bit, because I feel like, to you, maybe I was one of the people who encouraged you, and maybe even unknowingly put the pressure that, oh, your story of your family relative and the suicide, that that's what helps people to relate. I remember, I think I told you that, and now I feel guilty that maybe that was making experience difficult for you in some way, even unknowingly.
Well, you've uncovered my master plan is to bring you on this podcast and impart you with the most massive Jewish guilt trip possible.
Oh,
But to address that point, I don't. Maybe this is just me being honest. I don't remember that.
okay.
So maybe to take you down a notch on your sense of importance in that.
Great.
And but to bring it back to something I want to kind of a response I have, and also what I want to follow up with you on is I made that decision based on insights before I met you, right?
Mm,
I was basically a college student and I was getting external pressure to overemphasize the role of the suicide in my family as a catalyst for the founding of the organization.
I see.
And I had no experience, right? I had not ever had to tell my story publicly before. And I didn't understand what the implications would be of making that my public story.
Right.
Um, and for me, I didn't create that boundary. And so
Right.
I kind of, it was a bit of a Pandora's box. As soon as I used that as my catalyzing incident, and I do say used somewhat intentionally, because I do feel that it wasn't fully true, I lost control of it. And when I lost control of it, it created this experience for me of feeling a little bit as if I was exploiting the trauma and tragedy in my family as a means to justify my work. Um, and that ultimately was a factor that led to my burnout, right? When the story that I was telling actually physically pained me, that becomes unsustainable. And so to bring this back to you, one of the things you said 10 minutes ago in your answer was how you were very intentional about what to share in your story and what not to share in your story, right? And you had this insight. And so I guess I'm wondering what led you to go into your storytelling with such intentionality, with such a sense of boundaries, um, in a sense that I didn't have the wisdom to have when I was getting started.
I really appreciate you sharing that, first of all. And this is not something that's often talked about in general, right? And it's very important, I think, that this is being talked about, number one. Um, and luckily, I had a earlier experience being a musician and artist and having the story of my teacher's suicide. And occasionally I would share the story as a musician, and I had a very complex internal reaction to the fact that I shared the story. But then if I didn't share and people ask, just like, how did you uh, become electronic musician, and how did you switch from playing the piano to, like, that story was a catalyst. That's what happened. So I cannot just hide what happened if I try to answer the question. So I would share and I would feel this exactly how you described. Am I exploiting the story? And I think that when I started to sense sound, I had a therapist. By the way, I think having a therapist is a great idea for anybody, even healthy people. Everybody should have a therapist. Uh, and we had a very intentional process to set a clear boundary as to what I'm willing to talk in public from my experience of health complications, and what I'm not willing to talk about. We even practiced a little bit, like what to say. In interviews and things, people ask and people like to push a little bit, and it's not personal. So I just had to go back to that, rehearsed phrase that I'm just not comfortable talking about it. Or, one day I will maybe be ready to talk about it, but today is not the day. And people are very respectful for the boundary. But the difference is that was a very intentional process. And I also carefully observed how I do whenever I share the story. And I had an agency to edit that boundary as well. So I kept it to the level that up until here I talk, and I only talk that. So that did not exhaust me as much. It still exhausts me a little bit. You get to the point that you are sick of hearing your voice talking about the same story. But other than that, that process prevented me from the exhaustion.
I really appreciate you talking through your process because it's not something that I was ever coached on going into it. And I actually, I got a therapist about a year before I left ASAP. So 4 years into doing it.
Mm,
And we talked about this element in my story. And he said something, along the lines of, in a sense, you didn't have informed consent of what you were getting yourself into.
uh-huh.
And I think in some regards, from my experiences with other people who've been in the shoes that we've been in, is that you're in the minority in terms of the intentionality and agency you had over sharing your story. And I think a lot of other people, I could name a few, which I won't, come at it more from my angle, and this feeling of burnout and this feeling of losing control does really come from not having that initial intentionality and control around the story. So I just think it's important for you to name, and I'm just grateful for you kind of talking through it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There was a bit of a serendipity. So a few days ago, we had a prep call for this interview, and immediately after, I had a call with a designer who is working on the issue of mental health and human-centered design.
Hmm.
And she's so wonderful and talented, and she was telling me, "Oh, Yoko, the way you share your personal story as the beginning of your work, maybe I should do more of that because I also had a suicide in my family." And that was just immediately after we had that conversation that day, right? So
Hmm.
I had an opportunity to share with her immediately, about the importance of setting the intentionally setting the boundary before she sets out to share and create a narrative. And it's really for her, not for anybody else, but for her to protect herself. And she had lots of questions as to, oh, but and like all the answers really led to that. Like it's all about really protecting your boundary and yourself intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this all day. I think that piece of owning what you can own, especially
Mm,
if you're in a point where your story is all essentially part of your product, your service, or your impact, is so valuable because,
right.
especially if you're doing this in the social sector, whatever you want to call it, you are oftentimes not in the position of power. You are oftentimes appealing to funders, you're appealing to partners, and they view your story in a way that's different than you view it. They view
Right.
you as something on whom they can fundraise, right? They
Right.
view you as something that they can use in their marketing materials.
Right. Right.
And I didn't understand that. And I think people need to know that going in, because they're not going to look out for, and I'm doing a generalization, but many of those organizations are not going to even be thinking about what your best interests are because they're focused on a certain outcome for themselves.
Right. Right. It's really insightful that coming from your experience in non-profit, but my experience wasn't non-profit, so I kind of assumed in not-for-profit world, it's different from investors and things, but the framework is still very much similar. So yeah, that is very insightful.